पृथिवी शान्तिरन्तरिक्षगं शान्तिर्द्यौः शान्तिर्दिशः शान्तिरवान्तर दिशा शान्तिरग्निः शान्तिर्वायुः शान्तिरादित्यः शान्तिश्चन्द्रमा शान्तिर्नक्षत्राणि शान्तिरापः शान्तिरोषधयः शान्तिर्वनस्पतयः शान्तिर्गौः शान्तिरजा शान्तिरश्वः शान्तिः पुरुषः शान्तिर्ब्रह्म शान्तिर्ब्राह्मणः शान्तिः शान्तिरेव शान्तिः शान्तिर्मे अस्तु शान्तिः. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra sukhinas santu, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschit dukkha bhag bhavet, sarvastaratu durgani, sarvo bhadrani pashyatu, sarvas sadbuddhimapnotu, sarvas sarvatra nandatu. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our own hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Asato ma satkamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityorma amritam gamaya, aviravirmayeti, rudrayatte dakshinam mukham, tena mam pahi nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. We'll continue with where we stopped last week. Let's start on page 10, the first para. The Hindus have received their religion through revelation, the Vedas. They hold that the Vedas are without beginning and without end. It may sound ludicrous to this audience how a book can be without beginning or end. But by the Vedas, no books are meant. They mean the accumulated treasury of spiritual laws discovered by different persons in different times. Just as the law of gravitation existed before its discovery and would exist if all humanity forgot it, so is it with the laws that govern the spiritual world. The moral, ethical, and spiritual relations between soul and between individual spirits and the Father of all spirits were there before their discovery and would remain even if we forgot them. So we saw that in this paper, Swami Vivekananda is trying to gather the common basis of the Hindu tradition, that in spite of such stupendous variety and diversity, what is it that makes all of these extremely diverse people still self-identify as Hindus? What are the things that hold them together? And he begins with the Vedas. So several things to unpack in this paragraph. The first thing that we see is the importance of a book. In the beginning of this paper, Swamiji mentioned three of the oldest religious traditions in the world today: Hinduism, Judaism, and Zoroastrianism. And all the three of them have books. And even today, those traditions we see as like representing world religions, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, all of these major traditions, they survive. Among the many things that makes them their survival to this day possible is the centrality of their wisdom, their revelations in a form of a book. And many traditions which came, it might have created an impression among the generation, but didn't have a book to hold the community together, somehow didn't survive. That's what we see in history. So first of all, the importance of a book. But Swamiji here also says that while the Vedas are the revealed text that the Hindus affirm, first of all, he says they are not really books. And he says that they are the revelations that have been received at different times by different people. Now, eventually, these revelations did get codified in the form of a book. And we know the tradition itself is so old, it was long before things were even put down in writing. And so it's understandable why the way we understand the word book today, it didn't refer to it. The word Veda itself comes from the Sanskrit root vid, means to know. And so while in one level we can restrict Vedas to the book of the Hindus, if you go to the literal meaning of the term and the interpretation that Swami Vivekananda gives here, it simply means knowledge. And knowledge is not territorial. There is no such thing as Eastern knowledge or Western knowledge. What we can distinguish knowledge is from ignorance. But if it is truth, if it is really truth, then it has got to be universal. In other words, it's possible to include all of the great spiritual discoveries, all of the revelations that have occurred at different points in history, in different parts of the world, under this literal meaning of the word Vedas. So that's one thing to be kept in mind, that it's possible to see the Vedas not as limited to just one tradition, but being the treasury or spiritual laws that have been discovered everywhere. The truth that has been discovered and expressed and manifested and described in different forms and in different ways at different points in history. And it is in that sense the Vedas are often considered to be beginningless, that they never had a beginning, the thing is this, if they didn't have a beginning, then it's possible to think of them as not having end. One of the things that we learn is that if something has a beginning, it has got to have an end. And so that is the reasoning behind many of these philosophical entities, including the self, as we shall see soon, is never said to have had a beginning, because the beginning implies some possible end at some point. There's some other thing that needs to be mentioned here. Vedas are clearly not the only books that Hindus have. The Hindu tradition has a lot, it's huge. So there is, besides the Vedas, there are the epics, there is the mythology. In the mythological literature is called the Puranas. So there were 18 huge Puranas and 18, they call Upapuranas, subsidiary Puranas. So the literature, the religious literature that has been produced over the centuries has been immense. Broadly speaking, in the Hindu tradition, they divide the scriptures, the Hindu scriptures, into two categories. One category is called the Shruti. And Shruti literally means that which is heard. And the second category is called the Smriti, literally which means that which is remembered. So this first category called Shruti is the Vedas. And it's that which is heard because this, as Swamiji says, didn't have any human author. And so the rishis who intuited them didn't think of them intellectually. These were the revelations that came to them. And that's why the Vedas are said to be without a human authorship, which is really what revelation really would mean. If somebody would write something very scholarly, that could be yet wonderful, but it still would have a human authorship. But revelation, by definition, means that it came from a higher source. And those who noted it down, or in whose name today we receive it, they are merely the recorders of it. They were not the authors of it. While the importance of the book can never be overestimated, but still, books sometimes can do as much good as harm. Now, books clearly record the wisdom and which spans generations. People may come and go, people's ideals may get diluted, but the book is something that can return to, that won't change. Oh, about change, here's something. We know there are updated editions, there are revisions, revised editions. And so the question is, if the Vedas are so old, how do we know that they, in their present form, are exactly the way they were received? We know that when, and especially considering that in the early centuries, the wisdom was transferred orally. It wasn't even written down immediately. And every one of us knows, you tell something, a story to a friend, and the friend tells it to somebody else, and the way it travels through word of mouth, it'll change. Even if you don't intend to change it, some slight changes will occur. Now, one of the things that prevented that from happening in the Vedic literature was this strong belief right from the beginning that the sound of the Vedas was the primary thing. It was not the words, but the sound. And that if these revelations that were received, if they were not pronounced in the right way or pronounced wrongly, even if it's a slight change in the intonation, it won't produce the desired effect. And so therefore, Vedic chanting, the way these texts are to be chanted, it's a science in itself. So reading the text is one thing, but to be able to chant them in a way it needs special training. And so the belief in the tradition was that if these Vedic words was not chanted in exactly the same way, they won't produce the result. And therefore, there was this great fidelity to the original. They were very conscious to not even change a comma or a semicolon or the intonation of it, because then it wouldn't have an effect. And so this belief helped preserve the sanctity and the originality of the text. So that's the plus point of a revealed text. That is, there is some neutral, authoritative source you can go to should there be any doubt at any point, if you want to get your questions answered or doubts resolved. The downside to books is that when something gets sanctified, the human tendency is to then oftentimes start worshipping it. The book itself then becomes an object of worship. And then people begin to think that all that I need to do is acknowledge my allegiance to that book. Just worship it, show my reverence to it. It doesn't matter if it doesn't reflect in the way I live. It doesn't matter if the teachings of those books somehow don't translate into the way I lead my life. And so that is the real danger, a book worship, as they say. One of the, not exactly in these words, but the Buddha often cautioned against this book worship. He said that don't accept something just because it is written in some books, just because somebody says it. Try to test the authenticity of something by your own experience. And so that is one, we have to navigate between acknowledging the advantage of a literature, but also recognizing the dangers involved. One of the things that the Vedas themselves did, which is quite unusual in some ways, that the Vedas themselves say that the goal is to go beyond the Vedas. So the Vedas may be considered as a supreme authority in the Hindu tradition, but the Vedas themselves say you should go beyond it. So the tradition recognizes two kinds of knowledge. So there is a higher knowledge and there is a lower knowledge. And this actually gets described, this description comes in the Vedas itself, in an Upanishad called the Mundaka Upanishad, and which says lower knowledge includes, guess what? The Vedas. So it begins by saying lower knowledge is Vedas plus all, of course, the secular sciences and everything that goes by the name of knowledge from books. All of that is lower knowledge. But then what is higher knowledge? And then the Vedas say, that is higher knowledge by which the imperishable is known. Yaya tat aksharam adhigamyate. Aksharam means the imperishable, that highest truth, which is non-material, which never perishes, which is eternal. So the knowledge that makes that truth known is alone higher knowledge. Now that knowledge can come through the study of books. The scriptures can be instrumental in giving me that knowledge. But the book knowledge itself is not enough. Because what we study from books, what reflections we do, that knowledge is stored in our brain. That's very cerebral. Now, if that knowledge has to descend into my heart, to kind of use a mystical language, then alone that knowledge would become real, or the knowledge would become fulfilled. In other words, it's not enough to know, for instance, we have been told from childhood, by our parents, by our teachers, be truthful, be honest. And we might say, well, I have knowledge that being truthful is the right thing. Now, that knowledge is not enough, because it's possible for us to hear about it, and yet, in my life, I may not be as truthful as truthfulness would demand. And so, the actual knowledge of truthfulness will be when I actually begin to live truthfully. Truthfulness is practiced in the way I think, the way I speak, the way I work, the way I relate myself with other people. Now that would be a higher knowledge of truthfulness as opposed to the truthfulness that I may have read about in books or heard about from my elders. And so Vedic wisdom that we might get from books has to somehow become a part of our lived reality. And when that happens, the Vedas say the knowledgeable person, the enlightened person, stands on the head of the Vedas. Now that's a pretty revolutionary thing to say, especially in Eastern traditions, because in the East, they are very careful that things which are sacred should not be put on the floor. Your feet shouldn't touch them. And so people are very careful about those things. And what the Vedas says, one who has become enlightened stands on top of the Vedas. Now, they literally don't say that you're standing with your feet on it, but standing on top would kind of imply that. Now, that doesn't mean that you stop respecting the source of the wisdom, but what it does mean is that you no longer need it. Sri Ramakrishna often gave the example of a shopping list. Now, if I want to go and buy something, and I recognize I may not remember the things, or your to-do list that you might have, it's helpful to note it down as things you want to say, go into some grocery, and you keep that list. Now, when you actually go and buy that stuff, then you don't go now and worship that list afterwards. You just throw it away because the job is done. So, Vedas or scriptures, that's what they are like, really. They are, well, you don't call them shopping list, but they're really a map. As they say, the map is not the territory. Just because I have a world map doesn't really mean I have seen the world. So similarly, just because I have a book, and it might have all the wisdom in it, but just having a book doesn't mean I have become wise. Even reading the book doesn't necessarily mean I have become wise. Even understanding the book, not quite. Only when I start living. And then the Vedas make one thing clear, that I don't have to accept anything which doesn't make sense. So test everything that we read. Only if it resonates with your head and heart, only if it makes sense, then I must live it. Because the kind of a divided life that most of us lead, it's often very unconscious. By unconscious, I mean that there are a lot of things in life which make perfect sense to us. It's like, yeah, this completely makes sense. But oftentimes, that which makes sense to me may not be reflected in the way I live. And that's what really creates that inner division. The way I think, the ideals I cherish, and my day-to-day life. And spiritual life really means nothing other than bridging this gap, that my lived experience and my intellectual convictions or emotional aspirations, these division that has occurred, it all must come together and become a harmonious whole. And that is what Swamiji says is the way we understand the Vedas. And therefore, now Vedanta, we are the Vedanta society. So Vedanta clearly is a combination of two terms, Veda plus Anta. Anta means the end or the essence. So Vedanta really means the essence of the Vedas. We spoke earlier about this tremendous variety that exists within the Hindu tradition. And every sect, every denomination, every little grouping within the Hindu tradition might take many different forms. But if you dig deeper, you will find philosophically it derives its nourishment from the Vedas. And within the Vedas, the philosophical part of the Vedas are called the Upanishads. And these Upanishads generally come towards the end of the books when they were classified into 4 books and put together. And so Vedanta literally means the philosophical section of the Vedas. And so in one way of understanding the word Vedanta is that it is the philosophical foundation on which the Hindu tradition stands. And when this philosophical foundation matures or flowers through many cultural, social forms, it might take many different forms. But with the philosophical foundation is one and the same. So very briefly, the Vedas we said that were not really books, but at some point in history, we don't know when, at some point someone decided to bring all these things together, by which I think by this time, what the knowledge of the Vedas that was transferred orally from one generation to the next, that they had already started writing it down. There was no paper and no printing, of course, probably writing it on parchment and stuff like that. But at some point, one person, today we just give a collective name called Vyasa, decided to bring all these extant manuscripts together, and this whole of this Vedic literature, which had developed by that time, he compiled it into 4 different books. And that is why today the Vedas we speak about in the plural, as if there are 4 books. So they're not like 4 books written by 4 people. So this was this scattered, vast literature which at some point in history was brought together, compiled into 4 books. And the way these books were compiled, each of these books had 4 different parts in it, or 4 different sections in it. So very briefly, it is this. The first part of the Vedas was called the Samhita, and which usually contained hymns and prayers to divine sources, oftentimes to nature, but nature personifying the powers of nature. So there are a lot of these Vedic deities. You find the names like Indra, Varuna, Yama, and so on. Now, these are not the names of any people. One of the things that these Vedic sages did, and what they intuited, was that they saw this entire creation as living. And so you can see it's a very different worldview from a materialistic view, all just atoms and molecules and energy. This is not to deny that there are material particles, but in and through the world that we see today, what these sages saw was a living entity, a living reality. And so every phenomenon they came across, they saw as living. So if there is rain, there is air, there is water, there is fire, they saw that there is some living, presiding presence behind these forces of nature. And these forces of nature, therefore, personified in this way, were given different names. And then these became later known as the deities. Unfortunately, in the 17th, 18th centuries, when the early Indologists started translating many of the Eastern texts, these personified powers of nature, which these sages saw as divine, and when you start translating these Eastern texts into English, what? And this is the dilemma every translator faces. How do we translate a certain word or a certain idea into a different language and in a very different cultural setting? And rather unfortunately, one might think that they translated these different powers of nature as God, because they were already familiar with the word God, because the word God already had a specific theological meaning, and the way these deities were conceived, at least partly, seemed to feel a little bit like how God was perceived. And so the rather easy way out was, well, these are Hindu gods. And of course, there were many of them. And so, and then this whole debate, which begins with monotheism and polytheism, worshippers of many gods as opposed to worshipper of one God. Now, that's a big subject. And there's much we can talk about it. But that's how these deities then got translated as God. And then because there were many, there were God with a small g, which had to be then distinguished from this one God with a capital G. It all gets more complicated afterwards. So the first part of the Vedas had these prayers and hymns addressed to these different manifestations of the divine. The second section of the Vedas are called the Brahmanas. And what they contain are actually rules and methods of how to do some of these ancient worships and ancient rituals. They were very elaborate rituals. They didn't, there was no image worship. Oddly enough, image worship started in Hinduism after the Buddha. The Buddha was the one who saw how these worship of these, what we now see as gods, had taken away from the spirit of the tradition. And so he said, no, stop doing it. Look within, see the light within. And very typical of human nature, the first thing that they did after Buddha passed away, they made him into a god. And so the first images that were to be formed, one of the oldest images to be found in India, are the images of Buddha. And before that, all Hindu worship was actually in fire. So all Vedic worship was in fire. And so the rules in this second section of the Vedas are about how to build that fire. And very elaborate, how many bricks, what would be the shape of the Homakunda, as it is called. Extremely elaborate. The shape of the bricks, the size, the number of bricks, it's pretty intricate. So those rules were given about the rules of worship and ritual in the second section. The third section of the Vedas was called Aranyakas. Now, Aranyakas literally means in the forest. Aranya means a forest. So what this third section contained was the same worships and yajnas and sacrifices and rituals that were described ritually in the second part. All of those ones could be done mentally, a kind of a mental worship, So all of those rituals could be, to do external rituals, you have got to get things and do them. Now, it's also possible to just sit quietly and do all those worships inwardly, inside one's heart. So that method was described in the third section, called the Aranyakas. And the fourth section was called the Upanishads. That is where what Swami Vivekananda mentions here, the relation between soul and between individual spirit and father of all spirits. So these were like unchanging realities of life. So times might change, society might change, but the truth regarding the divine remains unchanged. So those unchanging principles were described and explained in the last section, the Upanishads. And that is the Vedanta. That was just pure philosophy. So the first three sections are sometimes clubbed together and called Karmakanda, the path of ritual. And the last section is called Jnanakanda, the path of the portion, the knowledge portion. Now these four sections of the Vedas were related to the four stages of life. So again, we're talking about prehistoric times when there were no schools to go to. If you wanted to study, you had to go to a teacher's home and stay there. So they would, and just be a part of the teacher's family, as it were, for some years until you received education. And so the only fees you gave were do whatever work. Just as when you're part of a family, you do stuff for your family. You don't think you're like doing a job. And so the student became a part of the teacher's family, did all the work like any children of the family would do, and then they learned their lessons and then they returned home. So the first time when the student goes to the teacher, the first thing that the teacher taught them was the first section, the Samhitas, taught them all these prayers and hymns. The first prayer that the student was taught in the Vedic period, the very first lesson was about that Gayatri prayer. The Gayatri prayer is simply about, it's a prayer to the highest being, non-anthropomorphic, not to any specific deity. And the way the source of knowledge is seen in the Gayatri prayer is light. And the brightest object of light, the most effulgent object that we on the planet Earth know is the sun. Clearly, in the larger scheme of life, the sun is not that great a star. It's a pretty somewhere in, well, our solar system itself is not the center of the universe, which took a while for people to realize. But for us, the sun is the brightest object. And so the sun is seen as the symbol of that light of knowledge. And then that prayer is really about awakening the power of intuition within us, intuitive understanding. Dhiyo yonaf prachodaya dhi. So that, yes, all of us have intellect, but in most of us, the full power of the intellect hasn't become manifested yet. In fact, it is said that there is such immense potential in the mind that most of us, we are really using only 1 or 2% of what the mind is capable of doing. And it is said that if someone can use even 5% of their mind, they'll be considered a genius in this world. They might get a Nobel Prize. Well, now some of the Nobel Prizes are already being announced. But 5% of the mind apparently is enough. Now, if we want to realize that highest truth, that 95% of darkness, that has to go. So the spiritual intuition will be fully awakened when there are no dark areas in one's own mind. And so that was the prayer. And the idea was, if you begin first by bringing clarity to the mind, then whatever we study afterwards will all begin to make sense. Swami Vivekananda once said, that if I have to do my education all over again, I would not read any books at all. So he said I would spend time in just training of the mind. Once the mind is trained, then whatever I want to know, I just have to focus the mind and get knowledge from it. Unfortunately, that ship has sailed for us. There's nothing we can do. We are a part of this system. We cannot change the system, but we can see how at very young age we allow so much information to go inside us without first making sure that there is enough ability to process all that information. Because otherwise, I might have a lot of ideas, but if I don't know how all those ideas are connected, then rather than being any help, it can only create kind of an intellectual indigestion, I think. It'll create more confusion. So in some ways, the less we read, the better off we are. Because more reading doesn't automatically translate into more wisdom. Anyway, so the student would go to the teacher would give them first teach all these prayers. And the teacher also taught the student how to do all these rituals and worships. Now, some of those worships, some of those rituals, the student could do right away. But a major part of those rituals really, in the Vedic rituals, can be done only after you're married. And so the student would only know how to do it without actually having the eligibility to do them. But some of those rituals which could be done in the student stage, the student did. Now, after that period of study, which could extend from 10 to 12 years, I don't know the exact number, but fairly long time, then the student would return home and then enter the second stage of life when they get married. Now, by the time the student is married, the parents have become older by then, obviously, and so the worship and the rituals that the parents have been doing, they then pass it on to their married children. So then they carry on the family traditions because now they have become eligible to do all those worships and rituals. And then the parents, then in those days, retired to the forest. And then they followed the third section, the Aranyakas. So whatever worships and rituals they had done all through their life, and done properly, that would bring about a certain purification of the heart. It will bring about certain clarity, which then they graduate into no longer having the need to do external worship. Then they can go to the forest and spend time doing internal worship. So that was the third section, the Aranyakas. Now, in olden days, a lot of these hermitages of these rishis were said to be in the wooded area. And that's where many of these people retired. Oftentimes in India, many of them went to a place like Benares or anywhere up in the foothills of the Himalayas, because that was felt to be, now I don't have to be in a busy part of a community. My children have grown up. They can take care of things. I need to now go inside. And so they would then retire to a secluded part. Today, because of deforestation, not too many forests are available everywhere. But people do retire to, well, there are retirement communities. In general, a place where we no longer have too much pressure of social commitments and other things, by which then I can have more time to look within. So that was the third section. So if one has followed all these three stages of life in the way they were supposed to be followed, then the person would have reached enough purity and clarity within to then reach that last stage. And that was the hermit life. And that was the fourth section where the Upanishads they studied. So this was a very graded course in one way, that gradually through different life's experiences, learning from our successes as well as failures, people would then gradually reach that goal of being able to not just read the Upanishads, but understand them and realize the truth of them in their own heart. Now, this was not meant to suggest that everyone has to go through this graded course. Because the Vedas also say, Yat ahareva virajet, tad ahareva pravrajet. In other words, when an inner call comes for any of these stages, one should just leave. It's not that everyone has to get married, everyone has to go have a retired life. This was the normal course for most people. But it was also seen that some people may have probably done some of these stages earlier. And that becomes easier, as we will see later on, because of the idea of rebirth. That we don't always start with a clean slate. We've already had a much longer past. Our this life we have started from the time we were born, but our existence did not start with birth. And so that is what makes so much diversity possible. That's why people are different. And so it's possible that some people at various stages in life find that they now are ready for the teaching of the Upanishads. And that's how this whole scheme of Vedic scheme was taught. So 4 books, each of the books, 4 sections, each of the section identified with a stage in life. Anyway, so this is just one paragraph here in the book, but there are a lot of these ideas that come when we start thinking about the Vedas. So I'll stop here today. Now, if you have any thoughts, ideas, comments, questions, feel free to ask. Mahindra?
So, Swamiji, you explained the 4 sections in the Vedas. So, what is the Rig Veda, Yajur Veda? We said, are these sort of the names only for those Vedas?
Well, these are the Vedic literature was divided into 4 books, and so each of these books. So these are the names of the 4 books: Rig Veda, Yajur Veda, Sama Veda, and Atharva Veda. And each of these has. So that is why the Upanishads. Now it's possible to say, oh, this Upanishad is from this Veda, and this Upanishad is from the other Veda. And because the Vedas are so vast, there is no one person who can say that I have read all the Vedas. In fact, when the Vedic wisdom was passed on, when it was still an oral tradition, it was certain sections of families preserved certain parts of the Vedas, and then they taught it to their children and taught it to their children. So no one really knows the entire Vedas, nor is it really necessary. Any other? Philip?
Thank you, Swamiji. First, I have a kind of a comment about how you pointed out very nicely that the oldest part of the Samhitas, the Vedas themselves, have been preserved, over millennia very accurately. We actually know this, as a matter of scientific fact, because it's been studied with comparativist methods, of Western scholarship. And the way we know that it's actually very accurate is because we have this vast distribution of the traditions of chanting from Nepal down into Sri Lanka, I don't know. And there's a great uniformity among them. There's almost no, very extremely little variation. And all the texts that we have the Kashmiri sort of Veda written down and so on, and other versions, recensions, and they display such great uniformity that it turns out that this memorization is practically more reliable than written transmission. When you have written transmission, there's always variations. But I wanted to ask you about, you've given a very nice summary of this whole vast literature. And it's a nice classification that everything corresponds to the 4 stages of life and so on. But it seems to me that the Upanishads are, you know, they pose a certain kind of metaphysical, philosophical problem, because they're these islands of philosophical, spiritual literature in what is otherwise an ocean of kind of ritualist literature. And I think it's in the Upanishads, which, I don't know, these stages, they're usually, the Samhitas, the Brahmanas, the Aranikas, and the Upanishads, they're seen as chronological as well as, you know, separate in terms of classification.
Yeah, generally chronological, not always.
Right.
When,
So
the
Isha is
Isha
right,
Upanishad,
right, is
Isha
right,
Upanishad
right.
comes in the Samhita portion. So, I mean, there is a variation, but these are kind of broad categorization here.
But what I wanted to sort of remark upon is that I think in the Upanishads only we have this idea that ritual by itself is not enough. And sometimes maybe even stronger. It depends, matter of interpretation, but sometimes people interpret them to say that, you know, we should move past ritual, that it's all really within. And some of them, like the Mundaka, for example, says that you have to, out of this Upanishad, you have to make this weapon, Aupanishadam Shastra, in which the arrow is your Atman, your soul, and the bow is Om. And you have to somehow, the science, the Vedantic science kind of puts you on this platform where tells you, it's kind of vaguely in that direction, that knowledge. We've told you everything that you can know, but now you have to point your arrow and find it, and vidhi, you know, it's a pun on like pierce it and also understand it, see it. And it's not a knowledge of propositions. It's not a knowledge that, you know, we have all these words, vidya and gyan, vigyan, and so on. But there is some kind of leap of perception that has to be made. And
Absolutely.
And this is only in the Upanishads for the first time. Of course, in the later commentaries, this is worked out. So how do we explain this? It seems like it's more than simply something for the sannyas, for this latest stage of life. It seems like a new insight, a kind of a new profundity that comes with this. And, you know, a more general thing than just something to explore in the late stages of life. Actually, they define the purpose of life as this.
No, as I said, this was a graded course. It doesn't mean that this will happen only in the late stage of life. So it's possible that Shankaracharya himself, or Vivekananda, many of these great ones, we see that they didn't get these insights only in the last stage of their life. So this was not meant to be like a rule. This is just a kind of if someone's life was to go in a kind of a grade, just like most of us, we would kind of go to first kindergarten and this, and then to school, and eventually would go. But then there will be certain geniuses who say, oh, I skipped, 1 year I did 5 years course. So there will be always exceptions to that. And that's what that text I mentioned, yadahareva virajet, tadahareva pravrajet. That is, one can skip all these things the moment viraja means purity. Once that purity enters into the heart, at that moment one can leave. One can kind of skip these middle sections. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Yeah. Anything else? Shikant?
Swamiji, is this during this Vedic time, was this meant for every section of the society at that time, or only specific people who can read and write, who go and study, or everybody did this? Like how currently we see that, at least in India, people who read or specifically knowing Sanskrit is very small portion of the society. So is the whole society used to follow this, or only few people used to?
I don't remember. I don't know. Well, there are several things. First thing is, clearly the whole social structure was very different then than today. For Vedic study, one thing that was necessary was what they say is, what today people say thread ceremony, the Upanayana. Upanayana literally means taking near and near to the teacher. So before the student was taken to the teacher's place, they had a small ceremony, Vidyarambha, the formal beginning of knowledge. And so people had to undergo that. So there were several things. First, this requirement was there, that they had to do this. The second thing was whether the student wants it. It wasn't compulsory. Third thing was also the availability. Now, at least if you're in big cities, there are schools available nearby. But even today in the world, there are parts of the world where there is maybe to go to school, you have to travel considerable distance. And a lot of students may want to go, but either they can't afford to go or it's just not humanly possible. So when such a thing exists even today, that proximity of a school may not be there, or enough opportunities to study may not be there. I'm sure it was the same case during Vedic time as well. And so I would think, and then again, we are just talking about prehistoric times, so I'm guessing as much as anybody else, so it's not that I'm speaking from personal knowledge, obviously. But I think at some stage, when the mythological literature came into being, the Puranas, the epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and all, I think I would imagine that a considerable part of the community, perhaps a major part of the community, I thought, would probably know about the tradition more from the secondary literature than from the major one. Because eventually, again, I don't know at what point and what proportion it went. Because at some point then, the study of Sanskrit, the study of the Vedas, did become, was seen as an elite form of this thing. So again, I don't know at what time it happened. What the Brahma Sutras, one of the three foundational texts of Vedanta, the Brahma Sutras do say, is that the study of the Vedas is not an absolute must to get the highest knowledge. The highest knowledge can come even from the study of Puranas or the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Because essentially, those books may couch the same truth, but through lives, through study of history or even fictional or non-fictional characters, that the same truths are taught in a more palatable way, even for those who may not be able to go and study this abstract philosophy. But what the Brahma Sutra does mention is that it's possible to have access to that wisdom even through these secondary texts. So a study of the Vedas was not considered mandatory to have a knowledge of God. The only thing that was required in those days was at least accept the Vedas as the highest authority, even though you may never have read about it. That's probably true with most of the Hindus today. I think most Hindus, how many Hindus read the Vedas? They just heard the word Vedas. I'm doubtful about how many of them even read the Upanishads. Again, it's not absolutely necessary, but in the orthodoxy required that you don't openly say the Vedas I don't believe in it. It would then you wouldn't be accepted socially as a Hindu if you just reject the most sacred text of the tradition. But that was more a kind of a social, cultural thing. But you didn't have to read it. You didn't have to study it. In fact, some of the 6 orthodox systems of schools of philosophy within the Hindu tradition, called the Shad Darshanas, actually many of them, at least 4 of them, they all acknowledge the supremacy of the Vedas. They have a few insights derived from the Vedas, but by and large, they are pretty independent philosophies. The only thing that keeps them within the orthodox fold is that they have not openly questioned the Vedas. So that was the only requirement, really. And so the only two of these philosophies, one is called the Uttara Mimamsa and the Purva Mimamsa. Purva Mimamsa is what is called the Karma Kanda of Jaimini, and the Uttara Mimamsa is what we know as Vedanta. So these are the two which depend primarily on the Vedic wisdom, right? Those philosophies developed. But the others, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Yoga, Sankhya, have a few things from the Vedas, but they were pretty independent in some ways. Yes.
You mentioned in the last week's lecture that Buddhism didn't come out and outright say that Vedas have the utmost authority. I was wondering, is that because Buddha was afraid that it would lead to book worship, or I guess why didn't he say that?
No, please say that again.
Oh, do you want me to repeat the whole question? So in the previous lecture, you mentioned that Buddhism didn't say that Vedas have the utmost authority. I was wondering if that is because Buddha thought that it would lead to book worship, or
Yeah,
I was wondering why that
so.
is.
Yeah. What he thought only Buddha knows, but at least I would imagine it was to see the danger of this book worship, how people can just idolize a book and really not look within. Yeah. Anish?
So Swamiji, when thinking about the four sections of the Vedas, the Upanishads seem the one to be the most universal. You know, I can understand, as a Western educated person, the Upanishads being the portion of the Vedas that are universal. I don't somehow understand how the remaining portions of the Vedas can be, universally, because they're about ways of doing worship and particular gods and goddesses. So to be revealed, text which is, infallible, it's hard for me to understand that as a Western educated person.
Absolutely. I mean, you're right. See, I think principles can be universal. And Upanishads deal with principles. And so I think they will resonate more over a much larger area than the ritualistic portion. Absolutely. Sure. Yeah. Akshay?
Swamiji, what are the risks associated with being exposed to advanced knowledge, spiritual knowledge, without being developed or ripe to receive that knowledge? Because in the age of the internet, it's quite plausible that one might come in contact with very advanced Vedantic wisdom without being developmentally ready.
Yeah, I think the risk is mitigated with humility. I think if we remember that just because something makes sense to me intellectually doesn't automatically mean that I have attained it. So long as we remain humble about that. And also, even if something I understand, to hold that understanding a little bit lightly, in the sense that to be willing to be corrected, or willing to modify my understanding should any future experience contradict my present understanding. Because sometimes what happens is, and this is the big subject, but very briefly to mention that I read something and I get some meaning out of it. And then I'm discussing it with a friend, and a friend has read the same thing, and a different meaning comes to the friend. And then we are discussing, like, I think this passage means this. And the friend says, no, I mean it means that. Now, what I mean by holding our understanding a little bit lightly is, can I look at these two interpretations of the text as objectively as possible, and be willing that it's possible that my friend's understanding probably makes better sense than my understanding. And then if I'm humble, I would be then say, yeah, I think what you say resonates with me more. Because if the ego can get so strong that sometimes, even if a part of me feels that that explanation is better, my ego would resist that, thinking that, well, but it's still my explanation. How can I let go of my explanation? So we want to then defend our understanding. That's the only risk. Otherwise, today it's very difficult to. Earlier days, when the student went to a teacher's place, there were really no books. So the only way to get the knowledge was from a teacher. And so the teacher would give me the first lesson and would not give me the second lesson until the teacher felt I was ready for it. And so it was a little safe in some ways. I wouldn't have access to things I wouldn't know what to do with. Today, because of the easy accessibility, we don't even need books now. We just need an internet connection. So you can really read any text. So that's the good side of it. The caution would be, I might read something. If I don't understand it, it's probably okay. If I misunderstand it, that's probably the thing. So yeah, kind of recognize the risk involved. That's a good question. So we will stop here today. And when we meet next week, we will go to the second part that Swamiji discusses. After discussing the Vedas, Swamiji then goes on to discuss about creation. How is creation understood in the Hindu tradition? That will be our focus on next Wednesday. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhur Muhu. On Sunday, we will have Antar Yoga, as we do every month. There will be reading, spiritual reading by members. There will be music. There will be a brief reflection by me. And then we will celebrate the birthdays of all born in the month of October. So if you have been born in October, or anybody of your family or friends are born in October, bring them along. We'll have a big cake waiting for everybody. That will be on Sunday. Next Wednesday, we will continue with this study. And this Saturday, we will not have meditation. So there's a big workshop on intuition we are holding in Duxbury. You'll find information about it on the Society's website page. Not the website, on the Facebook page. And so we won't have meditation on Saturday, but next Tuesday, we'll have meditation as usual. Let's conclude with the prayer on page 3 of your book. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.